Imagine a man standing alone in the untamed American wilderness. He builds a small log cabin with his own two hands, surrounded by silent pine trees and the deep, pristine waters of a secluded pond. For 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, he lives in absolute solitude. He grows his own food, reads the classics, and proves to the world that a human being can completely escape the corrupting, suffocating influence of modern society. This is Henry David Thoreau, and his book, Walden, is the sacred Bible of American individualism. It is the foundational text for every minimalist, every survivalist, and every person who has ever stared out of an office window and dreamed of running away to the woods. He is the ultimate symbol of rugged self-reliance. But what if I told you that this entire story is a carefully curated illusion? What if I told you that Thoreau's wild and isolated cabin was actually just a pleasant 30-minute walk from his family home? What if I told you that he frequently strolled back into town to have dinner with his friends, catch up on local gossip, and raid the family pantry? And what if I told you that while he was writing impassioned essays about the virtues of hardship and absolute independence, his mother and sisters were regularly walking down to his cabin to bring him freshly baked donuts, homemade pies, and to take away his dirty laundry? The father of American minimalism had his mother doing his chores. Today, on Deconstructing Minds, we are not just analyzing a philosopher, we are debunking a national myth. We are going to perform a psychological autopsy on a man who preached radical independence while living as a privileged, glorified freeloader. Was Thoreau a visionary who found the secret to a meaningful life? Or was he a man-child who couldn't handle the responsibilities of the real world, so he built a fantasy camp in his wealthy friend's backyard? Let's deconstruct the great American lie. To understand the famous Walden experiment, we have to look past the trees and examine the psychology of the man who planted himself there. Henry David Thoreau was not a rugged pioneer carving out a life on the brutal frontier. He was a classic, textbook case of what modern psychologists call failure to launch. Born in Concord, Massachusetts in 1817, Thoreau grew up in a comfortable, upper-middle-class environment. His family owned a very successful pencil-making business. He was sent to Harvard University, where he received the finest education available in the United States. He was undeniably brilliant, but he was also arrogant, exceptionally stubborn, and profoundly lazy when it came to anything he simply did not want to do. After graduating from Harvard, Thoreau refused to participate in the standard economy. He refused to pursue a traditional career in law, medicine, or the clergy. He refused to get married or start a family. Instead, he lived in his parents' house, or hopped between the guest rooms of his wealthy friends well into his late 20s. His escape to Walden Pond wasn't a brave, dangerous leap into the unknown. It was an arrangement. The land he built his cabin on didn't even belong to him. It belonged to his mentor, the famous and immensely wealthy philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thoreau wasn't a trailblazer braving the elements. He was a house-sitter with a very good vocabulary. Psychologically, Thoreau suffered from a massive superiority complex mixed with extreme avoidant personality traits. He looked at the people of his town, people working long hours in factories or on farms to feed their children, and he famously wrote that the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. He viewed their jobs, their families, and their daily struggles as pathetic and meaningless. But his judgment was blinded by his own privilege. He didn't want to join society because he genuinely believed he was too good for it. His philosophy of self-reliance was only possible because he had a robust, invisible safety net of family and rich benefactors waiting to catch him if he fell. He didn't escape the complexities of life. He simply outsourced his survival to the women in his family and the generosity of his friends.
He was the 19th century equivalent of a trust fund kid, moving into a luxury van to teach the working class about the beauty of having less.
Let's be brutally honest about the famous Walden experiment. For 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, Thoreau lived in a 10 by 15-foot cabin. He grew beans, he fished in the pond, and he wrote his masterpiece. It sounds like a grueling survivalist epic, but when we strip away the poetic language and look at the historical record, a very different picture emerges. Thoreau's minimalism was highly selective, and his isolation was a literary illusion. First, the cabin was situated right next to a major road leading into town. He had visitors almost every single day. The deep philosophical solitude he wrote about was essentially a performance. He wasn't a hermit. He was just a guy who built a man cave in the woods where he could entertain his intellectual friends without paying rent. Second, while he claimed in his book to live purely on the fruits of his own labor, mostly beans and water, his own journals and the accounts of his neighbors tell a much cozier story. He regularly walked into Concord for hearty, home-cooked meals at his parents' house. His mother and sisters didn't just bring him clean laundry, they brought him freshly baked pies and donuts. Psychologically, Thoreau was practicing what we might call curated authenticity. He was the world's first minimalist influencer. Long before Instagram, Thoreau was carefully editing his reality, applying a philosophical filter to his life to make it look much harsher, purer, and more romantic than it actually was. He was selling a fantasy of absolute self-reliance while secretly depending on the invisible labor of women and the financial backing of his friends. He famously wrote, "Simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. I say, let your affairs be as 2 or 3, and not 100 or 1,000. This is fantastic, inspiring advice if you are a man with no mortgage, no spouse, no children, and no real job. He didn't simplify his life by mastering its challenges, he simplified his life by avoiding them entirely. On Deconstructing Minds, we view this as the ultimate manifestation of privilege blindness. He preached to the struggling masses about how easy it is to live with nothing, completely ignoring the fact that his nothing was subsidized by everyone around him. If Walden made Thoreau the patron saint of nature, his essay Civil Disobedience made him the godfather of political rebellion. It is a text that would go on to inspire giants like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. The essay was born from Thoreau's famous arrest. He refused to pay his poll tax as a protest against slavery and the Mexican-American War. The myth presents Thoreau as a hardened political prisoner, a lonely martyr standing bravely against the crushing weight of a corrupt government. But the reality of his rebellion is, once again, much more pathetic and incredibly revealing. First of all, he wasn't protesting alone. He was part of a broader, town-wide tax revolt. But Thoreau was the only one arrogant enough to practically demand his own arrest. When the local tax collector, a man who actually offered to pay the tax for Thoreau out of his own pocket to avoid the hassle, finally locked him up, Thoreau was thrilled. He had his stage. But how long did this heroic stand against the state actually last? He was in jail for exactly 1 night. The very next morning, an unidentified woman, most historians agree it was his Aunt Maria, marched down to the jailhouse and paid the tax for him. When the jailer unlocked the cell and told Thoreau he was free to go, Thoreau was furious. He didn't want to leave. He threw a fit. He wanted to stay in his cell and be a martyr for the cause. The jailer literally had to force him out onto the street. Psychologically, Thoreau was a master of symbolic posturing. He desired the aesthetic of the rebel, the glory of the dissident, but he had absolutely no appetite for the actual grinding sacrifice of long-term imprisonment. His 1 night in jail was the greatest branding opportunity of his entire life. His monumental essay on civil disobedience wasn't written from a place of deep, prolonged political suffering in a dark cell. It was written by an angry, privileged intellectual who was bailed out by his aunt before breakfast. This doesn't completely invalidate his brilliant ideas about government overreach, but it exposes the man hiding behind the myth. He was a man who was far better at writing beautifully about sacrifice than he was at actually making one. Henry David Thoreau did not die alone in a rugged cabin in the wilderness. He died at the age of 44 in his childhood bedroom inside his parents' comfortable house in Concord. The cause was tuberculosis, a slow, wasting disease that confined him to the very domestic life he had spent his career criticizing. As he lay dying, his Aunt Louisa asked him a profound traditional question. Had he made his peace with God? Thoreau, even on the absolute brink of death, couldn't resist one final act of intellectual arrogance. He looked at her and calmly replied, "I did not know we had ever quarreled." His last whispered words were equally revealing. As he slipped away, he reportedly muttered just 2 words: Moose. Indian. Psychologically, these final moments show us a man who, until his very last breath, lived entirely inside his own imagination. His famous last words were not about the family members weeping at his bedside. They were about the romanticized symbols of the wild, untamed nature he had written so beautifully about, but never truly surrendered to. He dreamed of being a wild beast or a free native of the forest, but he died a Harvard-educated writer in a soft bed, surrounded by the exact societal comforts he claimed to despise. The ultimate tragedy of Thoreau is not that he was a hypocrite, but that he was a man who never fully lived. He was paralyzed by his own intellect. He analyzed life so intensely that he forgot to actually participate in it. His Walden experiment wasn't a brave journey into nature. It was a highly controlled retreat from the terrifying messiness of human relationships, financial responsibility, and the risk of failure. He built a fortress of words to protect himself from the quiet desperation of his own heart. So, if Henry David Thoreau was a privileged, self-obsessed man-child who faked his great escape from society, should we just throw his books in the trash? On Deconstructing Minds, our autopsy reveals a much more complicated truth. Yes, the man was a fraud, but the idea he created was pure genius. Walden is not a documentary, it is a work of myth-making. Thoreau didn't write about his real life, he wrote about the life he desperately wished he had the courage to live. And in doing so, he gave humanity a powerful, enduring fantasy. He gave us the fantasy that we can unplug, that we can start over, and that we can find our true selves simply by stripping away the noise of the modern world. Thoreau's hypocrisy doesn't invalidate his message, it actually makes it profoundly human. He wasn't a perfect, enlightened guru speaking down to us from a mountaintop. He was one of us. He was a flawed, anxious person, suffocating under the heavy expectations of his family and his culture, who just happened to find a beautiful way to express that universal feeling of being trapped. He reminds us that sometimes a beautiful lie can be more psychologically useful than an ugly truth. We don't read Walden to learn how to build a cabin or how to farm beans. We read it to remember that we have a choice, even if that choice is just a daydream we entertain while sitting in traffic or staring at a computer screen. It is a dream that keeps us sane. Thoreau didn't give us a literal map to the woods. He gave us a psychological escape hatch out of our own quiet desperation. And for that, we can probably forgive him for the donuts. Whose mind should we deconstruct next? Let us know in the comments. And remember, sometimes the most important truths in history are told by its greatest liars.